Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Judy Hertig. I'm the Artistic Director at Hancher, and I think we have a really fascinating afternoon for you. As you know, this discussion is kind of a lead-in to the premiere, world premiere of Terry Riley's Sun Rings that will happen at Hancher on Saturday with Kronos Quartet, a choir from the School of Music. And a visual installation that I am really excited to see. I can't tell you anything about it, but I'm sure it's going to be fabulous, by Willie Williams, who we hope sneaks in here at some point. But I'm sure you know many of these people, certainly Professor Don Gurnett, David Harrington, the first violinist of Kronos, Terry Riley, the composer of Sun Rings, and Hank Dutt, the violist. I'm not going to get into all kinds of bios when you come on Saturday to Hancher. All of that information is included in the playbill. There are tickets available. There are tickets for university students at $10. You can call the Hancher box office at 335-1160. You can order online at uiowa.edu/Hancher, or you can just come to the box office. So I hope to see you on Saturday. Thanks.
Okay, I'll lead off the discussion. My name is, as she said, is Don Gurnett. And this is a very unusual, I think, collaboration between art and science, one that I'm very pleased to get involved with, and I've had a lot of fun with these other people here. And my part in this has to do with the sounds of space. And so I'm going to give you a bit of history about that. I'm going to play a bunch of recordings from spacecraft that where we've received these signals. So you'll have that represented kind of the background, or I guess the input into their interpretation, which is going to be played on. They're going to make this performance on Saturday evening. Now, sounds of space, that may sound unusual. You think of space as being a vacuum, nothing up there. How can you have sounds? In fact, space, there's a gas up there that permeates the entire universe. It's an ionized gas, a little bit different than down here. And it's amazing. There's all kinds of sounds come out of this gas, this ionized gas that we call plasma. Now, I said I'd give you a brief history about this. Actually, the first evidence of sounds from space dates back a long time ago, actually World War I. There was a guy by the name of Barkhausen. A vacuum tube amplifier had just been invented, and he was a German. And he was an engineer, and he was assigned a task to try to spy on the British telephone communications. And so he stretched out a long wire antenna on the ground, hooked it up to his amplifier, and he listened. And it doesn't say whether he heard any sounds from the British, but he heard these whistling tones that came to be called whistlers. They kind of go like that. And I'm going to play some whistlers here in just a minute. And this puzzle, he published this in Nature. I've got the article up in my office. And he describes it was the first theory of whistlers. What he said, it sounded like the grenades being thrown over the battle lines. That was the first theory of whistlers. And the topic just remained dormant for almost 35 years until 1953. A guy by the name of Owen Story finally presented a theory of how whistlers occurred. And if you give me the first slide, and maybe you can turn the lights down just a bit. Owen's story showed that whistlers are produced by lightning, that you get a lightning stroke here at the Earth, and you can hear that on a radio in a car. You can hear when a lightning stroke goes off, you hear a click. And that sends a wave up here into this ionized gas that we call plasma. And it's kind of like a sound wave, but it has electrical properties because it's ionized, and so it's like a radio wave too, kind of a combination sound wave, radio wave. And it turns out in this ionized gas, the high frequencies travel faster than the low frequencies, and the signal tends to follow the Earth's magnetic field line. And since the high frequencies travel faster, they get to you first. If you have a receiver down here, and the lower frequencies get there later, so you hear a thing that goes like this. By a great coincidence, I was just talking about this morning in my plasma course. I didn't intend it to come out that way. Now, so Owen Story had an explanation for these curious things, which are rarely heard actually on Earth with radio receivers. And the next big event was really the start of the space age, which actually started here at the University of Iowa. Well, it actually started with the Russians with Sputnik 1 first, but then the U.S. launched Explorer 1. And Professor Van Allen, you want to stand up, wave your hand? He flew out, right, thank you. He flew a Geiger tube on Explorer 1 and discovered the Earth's radiation belt, that the Earth was surrounded by this intense radiation belt, which I'll comment on here in just a second. Now, I, by good fortune, showed up here just about that same time, and I started working for Van Allen's group in 1958, late 58, I think it was, and fairly quickly I got involved. I was interested in electronics, and I was an electrical engineer, and by a couple of years, I had gotten to the point I was actually designing these entire spacecraft. Like there's one called Engine 3. And so I was heavily involved in the spacecraft design business here. Then there was a guy by the name of Roger Gallet from the National Bureau of Standards out in Boulder, Colorado. He showed up here one day and he played a recording of these whistlers. And I thought it was kind of a neat sounding effect. Really not interested in music, but it was the first inclination to have something to do with music. And I just on a whim decided to go out and build a receiver to see if I could detect whistlers. In fact, I've got the prototype of the receiver. I brought it down here today if anybody wants to look at it afterwards. And I took this thing out in the country, actually to my parents' farm, because you have to get away from 60-cycle power lines, otherwise you can't detect, the power line makes too much noise around the city. And I think over a period of maybe I was out there 4 or 5 times and I heard like 3 whistlers. Really hardly any. And I convinced Professor Van Allen and the rest of his group to fly this thing on a spacecraft, and I came up with what I thought was kind of an innovative idea of transmitting the signal to the ground using the transmitter. And I have to admit, I wasn't totally sure it was all going to work because we also had to get the digital data down, but I designed a system to transmit the signal down to the Earth. And just to show you, let's go to the next slide, which is, I think, Engine 3. This shows Engine 3. And that guy holding the antenna, that's me, that young kid. That's back on December 12th. The spacecraft was launched December 12th, 1962. Will be just in another couple months, 40 years ago. And I have to say, one of the vivid memories in my life is when the spacecraft went into orbit. A few days later, we came back to Iowa City here, and we sent the command to turn the transmitter on. And the first thing we heard were just tremendous numbers of whistlers and other weird sounds. And I'll give you a feeling for that. Let's see, you can play it, why don't you play the next one. This is the kind of thing we heard when we turned the transmitter on. These are whistlers. And these are produced by lightning. And we don't sit around in our office listening to these things all the time. We have a more sophisticated way of analyzing. We make frequency time spectrograms. And I'll play the same thing again, and we'll show a spectrogram with a cursor. A spectrogram has frequency along this axis, time along this axis. This is kind of the science part now. Go ahead and play it. These are whistlers. See, like here's one right here. Now, in addition to whistlers, we also heard another thing that's now called, sometimes called dawn chorus. And this signal is not produced by lightning. This is spontaneously generated in the radiation belt. We didn't know that at the time. At the time the spacecraft was launched, people had heard these things on the ground, but had no clue what it was. I believe that's a fair statement. And so let's go to the next one. This is now dawn chorus. The spectrogram, here's frequency and time. See, this is 10 seconds. Usually consists of these kind of rising tones. And it has all kinds of variety of sounds to it. The reason it's called dawn chorus, it sounds like the song that birds make when they wake up in the morning. You know, if you've ever been to Hawaii and the mynah birds wake up in the morning and they start singing, okay, play dawn chorus. So this is what we heard when we turned the transmitter on for the first time, and the spectrogram that goes with it. Now, dawn chorus, we now know, because of Van Allen's discovery of the radiation belt and later analysis, I made the first space measurements of this dawn chorus, plotted where it was most intense and all that sort of thing. And let's go to the next slide. We now know that in the Van Allen radiation belt, the electrons, this isn't going to be a science lecture, but I'll just give you a little basics here. The electrons in the radiation belt spiral around the magnetic field like this, and they bounce back and forth between two mirror points here. And it turns out that in this medium up here, these electrons can get together synchronously and rotate, and they spontaneously emit these plasma waves. Some people suggest it's kind of like a laser, but it's a plasma laser. And I'd like to make an analogy how unusual this is, because, you know, like here in this room, it's as though the molecules up in one corner of this room just suddenly got together and put out a whistle. That doesn't happen, right, in our atmosphere, but up there it does. And it turns out this has some important implications on radiation belts, because when that wave's generated, it affects the trajectory of the particle, and instead of bouncing back and forth here forever, it goes down and hits the atmosphere. So the main loss mechanism for particles in the radiation belt for electrons comes from the emission of these waves. And humankind's attempt to achieve controlled fusion also has the same problem. You put this hot fusion plasma in a magnetic field, it starts developing waves and makes the particles go over and hit the wall of the chamber. I just wanted to tell you there's a little bit of science associated with this, not just sitting here listening to these cute sounds. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, over the years, we've flown, I think, something like 35 different spacecraft to various places around the Earth and to almost every planet in the solar system. And one of the most famous missions was Voyager 1 and 2. There are actually two spacecraft. We launched from Earth, went to Jupiter, went by Saturn, and actually right now, Voyager 1 is still operating. That was 25 years ago. It was launched in late August. The two of them were launched in late August, early September 1977. Voyager 1 now is the farthest, most distant human-made object from Earth. It's out twice as far as Pluto. It takes a third of a day for the radio signal to get back to the Earth. We're not out at a light year, but we're out at a third of a light day from Earth. Now, when we went by Jupiter, we detected lightning at Jupiter. It was the first detection of lightning at a planet other than Earth, and we did it by hearing whistlers as we went by the planet. Run the next one, which I think is whistlers. Is that right, Joe? Yeah. Now here's the detection of. You hear it? Could everybody hear the whistlers? They're rather weak. Jupiter's really big, and we're quite a long ways away, and the rate at which the frequency comes down is quite different. Now, we also detected chorus, dawn chorus at Jupiter. Sounds a little different, but it really sounds kind of eerie, I think. Why don't you go ahead and play the dawn chorus when we went through the Jupiter has a radiation belt, has a very strong magnetic field. So here we go. Sounds like some kind of weird song that Jupiter is playing for us. There's another one. There are things called electron cyclotron harmonics. The electrons rotate at a certain rate in the Jupiter's magnetic field. This also happens at the Earth, and you can hear tones that come on, switch on and off at harmonics of the electron cyclotron frequency. It's like you're playing a musical instrument. Why don't you play this one now? These are electron cyclotron waves. And you can see the harmonics right there through the pitch. So can you hear it switching between harmonics there? We can explain that. We'll talk about that in the plasma physics course later this year. Now, our latest thing, I don't want to spend too much time. I'm going to have to finish pretty quickly here, but let's go to the next slide. One of our latest instruments that we flew in space is on a set of 4 spacecraft called Cluster. It's a European Space Agency project, and it's in Earth orbit. And we fly these 4 spacecraft very close together, kind of in formation. And the whole idea is, you see, it's like 4 weather stations. So if there's like a cold front comes across, space equivalent of a cold front, we can detect the orientation of the cold front. Or if a wave propagates by, we can hear it arrive at one spacecraft, then the second, then the third, and by the timing you can get the velocity of the wave and things like that. Now this has, even David, you haven't heard this because we just got this going recently. Having 4 spacecraft here, each transmitting back to an antenna on the ground, we can produce now quadraphonic sound, which we've done a little work in just the last few days, and I'll have to thank some of my engineering people here, Jim Phillips, especially, and Rich Huff, for making this happen. Now we have 4 speakers up here. Here's one, here's one, here's one, and here's one. So what you want to think about is each one of those is a spacecraft, and like a whistler goes by, and you'll hear it at one, then the next, and so forth. So why don't we play a whistler? You all know what whistlers are. They're produced by lightning, so why don't we play this one? There's actually 3 whistlers here. Can you hear it? Now, there's an even more wild thing, one that, well, I'll let you listen to this. When we fly over the aurora, we get plasma waves, essentially kind of radio waves, emitted by the electrons that are causing the aurora. You know what the aurora is? It's up, we don't see it here in Iowa very often. It's usually up in Alaska. It's a light in the atmosphere. Go to the next slide. You'll show a picture of the aurora here just to remind people what it is. 15, okay, I'm almost running out of time here. So, okay, what we're going to do play next is quadraphonic sound as we're flying over the aurora with these 4 spacecraft. So go ahead and play this. These electrons all make, okay, here we go. Can you hear that? Okay, I really thought that was pretty neat. Could you hear this out here? Sounds like it's going from one speaker to the other and all this. And I haven't got a clue how to explain all that, although there are people actually working on this. Let's go to the next slide now. If you're interested, if you're interested in pursuing this subject, we have a lot of these sounds on a web address up here. You can just look my email address up here, DAG, that's me, Donald A. Gurnett. When you get to that point, click on Sounds of Space, Kronos Quartet. There's another one that says Sounds of Space in general. And I might make one more comment. If you're interested, really into this and you want to go listen to tapes, we have a warehouse over here with 70,000 magnetic tapes, and they're not the little ones either. So that's a collection of about 40 years worth of this stuff. And there's a guy here, actually, Paul Holland. Is he here, Paul? He was going to come, but I don't know if he got here. Maybe not. Anyway, Paul used to process this stuff, and he's probably heard a good fraction of those tapes. So, David, I'll turn this over to you next. And maybe you can tell how you got involved with this.
Wow.
Involved with me, I guess. Yeah, you can use that speaker.
I would actually much rather listen to Don. Is this on? No. Is this on now? Yeah. I find the way you talk about nature and the world and sounds to be so incredibly interesting that personally I'd rather listen to you, but to just for a minute briefly give you an idea of how Kronos got involved. One day, totally out of the blue, in fact, the quartet was on tour in Europe. Our office got a call from a man named Bert Ulrich from NASA. And his question to us was, would we be interested in somehow including some of the sounds from the Voyager expeditions in our concerts? And so I got a phone call from our manager, Janet Cowperthwaite, and I think I was in Vilnius or somewhere like that at the time. Anyway, so I got a call from Janet, and that's the question. And I said, well, I've never heard these sounds. Could I hear them? And so in a few days, we had a tape sent. And what happened to me is that I found these sounds incredibly interesting. And it sounded like part of nature. And I have a lot of CDs in my collection, and I have, sounds of different animals and whales and porpoises and all kinds of insects. And it didn't sound like those to me, but there was some relationship. I recognized these sounds as natural sounds somehow. And a few weeks later, I got back, and then I wanted to find out, where did they come from? And so Bert said that I should be in touch with Don Gurnett. And so I ended up calling his office, and I talked to Kathy, and very soon we were on the phone together. And what occurred to me is that it would be great to have a piece written, a piece of music written. And the only composer that I could think of, and I know hundreds of composers, but the only composer that came to my mind as the person that absolutely had to do this was our good friend Terry Riley. And we were in the process of recording one of his wonderful pieces, and I thought I'd wait and ask him when I could look at his response and see, the instinctive response to this idea. And immediately when I asked him about this, and I said, Terry, would you like to write a piece that somehow included some of these sounds from the Voyager expedition? And his whole face lit up, and it was clearly something that he was really interested in. So a few weeks later, Terry and I went to a launch at Cape, what's it called?
Kennedy Space Center.
Kennedy Space Center, yeah. And a few weeks after that, then I was in Iowa City, and I got the personal benefit of spending the day with Don. And I remember calling my wife that evening after I was in your office all afternoon, and I said, I think I understand the universe more now, and she said, well, tell me. And right at that minute, I couldn't remember anything you'd said. And eventually, I think a similar thing happened to Terry, and I think it's now your turn.
Don, you're such a tough act to follow. Yes, well, back in 1980, I wrote a piece for Kronos called The Sunrise of the Planetary Dream Collector. And I think that was one of the reasons David chose me to...
No, I think you're the most spaced out composer I know.
So, I'm having a senior moment here.
I just want to interject my own comment here. Shortly after one of your visits here, I think it was the Cedar Rapids Gazette had your picture in the paper with my name under it. And my wife started getting calls saying, gee, now that Don's gone into music, he's really changed.
We were thinking of printing up a T-shirt on, and,
No, that was good.
that was really funny. I wondered if you'd seen that.
Well, anyway, David and I did go down to the Kennedy Space Center to see this launch of one of the space shuttles, and that was really that day I'll never forget. I mean, just to have seen that and to kind of see how this whole thing operates and how science and astronauts putting their lives on the line, going up, on these really incredible missions, was very meaningful. And I knew then that more than ever I'd like to do something that kind of tied humanity together with the whole project. I mean, in the sense that all kind of aspects of humanity. So that was a big moment for me. And then a few months later, or maybe a month later, I came to visit Dr. Gurnett, and I thought I was going to have an hour meeting. And my memory of the thing is I came in at 10 in the morning, and I think he dropped me off at my hotel at 10 that night. And like David, I felt like I had spent the day with Galileo or something, and was sorry that I didn't have the benefit of...
Yeah, Terry called me and he said, I'm not sure whether it was Isaac Newton or Galileo.
But I said I wish I'd had the background and the benefit to decipher all the equations he was drawing for me. But I have a pile of them on my piano now, so I'm hoping they'll somehow get into my consciousness. He sent me home with a bunch of really wonderful recordings, some of which you heard today, and two of which actually formed two of the pieces out of the 10 pieces of this piece is called Sun Rings that we created for the evening on Saturday night here at Hancher Auditorium. And two of the pieces he played parts of. One was the chorus, Dawn chorus, and the other was the cyclotron frequency, electron cyclotron frequency harmonics, which we call now the electron cyclotron frequency parlor.
You should have them play that and then sing the melody that you hear in it.
Okay, well, I actually modified the melody. I'll sing you the melody that I created out of it. If you have the electron cyclotron frequency. So the very first thing that comes on there is something that goes like da 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 da. It's a little bit out of my range, but that's what I heard in this tape, and that became kind of like the opening motive for this electron cyclotron frequency parlor, which we call it, because I imagine that out there in space there are actually living rooms and things where these electrons are living in, and maybe they're taking anthropomorphic forms and enjoying themselves as much as we do. The other one was, the other melody that I really found quite beautiful and really inspired me to write a piece was the Jupiter, I guess in this case it was Jupiter Whistlers. Do you have that one there? Was there another tape you played with Jupiter? It must have been chorus. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's the chorus. Erie's a good way to. Yeah. So the beginning of this tape has a minor third interval, like, ba-da, ba-da, and then later it goes ba-do-do, but I'm putting it into more normal frequencies, like pitches. But that's the melody that I kept hearing this, because when I took these tapes into my studio, I'd loop sections of them so I could hear them over and over again and try to really become familiar with the whole landscape of what the melodies were. So, by studying them for a long time, I started hearing counterpoints and other things that I then tried to put into the quartet parts. And then the quartet, of course, is playing against these natural sounds like this, which, again, have been tweaked a little bit by my collaborator, Dave DeVoren, who worked a lot with the audio of these tapes.
Also, what began to happen is that sun rings, the ring got larger and larger and larger as time went on, and at a certain point, we realized that there absolutely had to be a visual component. And Janet Cowperthwaite had been to, she's been to many U2 concerts over the years, but the most recent one that she went to, she was very much impressed with the way that they used, they turned this very large arena into essentially a small space. And she found out that the guy that did that was Willie Williams. And so Janet thought, this is perfect for sun rings. And so eventually we're in touch with Willie, and I'll turn the microphone to Willie now.
Here I am. No, it was wonderful.
Switch it on.
Two, 1, 2. No, there we go. I got this rather timid email from Janet, who I think was encouraged by the fact that she'd heard I lived in San Francisco, which I did until the week before she called me. And I just moved back to London. But she sent me this email saying, look, I know this is a really long shot, et cetera, but would you be interested in, et cetera? And of course, it just seemed like the most wonderful opportunity. So we met up. I went and met Kronos in Europe when they were over. And I understood initially that we'd be able to use the sort of slide archive from Voyager and other NASA projects. So I began to amass all this stuff, which is wonderful. But it was only really coming here in June where we were rehearsing the piece, and we got to meet Don and Kathy and everybody here, where I began to realize that wonderful though these slides are, they are kind of out there. You see them on screensavers and calendars and mouse pads and everything. Whereas some of the stuff I saw in this room is moving footage, and it's either video footage or time-lapse footage, which is really, really wonderful stuff, because you don't see it. Well, you guys might see it, but but people in the regular world don't see this kind of thing nearly as often as the sort of wonderful Hubble pictures of the nebula and this kind of thing. So that was one thing I started to collect. Also, of course, the equations started to pile up. And
I've got some too, by the way.
And there were occasions, actually, when I did have to point out that this was a piece of art, not a physics lecture. But
there will be an exam after this.
But in the same way that Terry was hearing these sounds, these physical sounds, and abstracting them musically, because hearing beauty in them and extracting them musically, I was looking at this information, some of which made sense to me and some of which didn't. But within it, there are some things which are really beautiful. So I collected all this material along with the footage which was gradually starting to come in. And it's interesting because some of it directly relates to what we're hearing, not necessarily at the same time, but some of it really is connected to the visuals, and some of it is pure abstraction. And I also let my imagination wander. There are some other pieces which carry the mood of the composition as a whole, rather than being sort of specific to the different physical elements. And that was fascinating. And the third aspect for me was reading about Voyager and the information that's on Voyager about Earth. And as you probably know, there's a whole informational package there on board Voyager in case they meet anybody on the way, you know. And there's a whole book about it, and it's very touching. And the thing I found most touching about this is that obviously all the information was compiled prior to Voyager being launched in the 70s. So there are photographs of, you know, humans and the way we move and reproduce and live and everything. And then there are sort of cultural photographs, but they're all taken in the mid-70s, so they have this wonderful kind of dated quality to them. And even pictures of buildings somehow, I don't know, there's just a different mood to them. And because 77 was the year of the first Star Wars movie and the first Concorde, it seemed like a time where people were very optimistic that somehow space might hold the future. And of course it was the middle of the Cold War as well, so probably as a retreat from the sort of petty conflicts of Earth, people were sort of very hopeful about space. And it seemed quite touching to me that should Voyager meet anybody out there, that the aliens that look through this stuff will imagine that that's who we are, even though obviously our world has moved on in many, many ways. And I sort of pictured them like eccentric grandparents with graduation photos of their grandkids, you know, even though their kids are now long grown up. So, as I say, I was both intrigued by the basic physics and also quite thrilled to just be able to follow my own kind of abstractions from it. So, yeah, so that's what I'm doing.
Why don't we see if there's any questions from the audience who would like to ask these brilliant people some questions here.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question that I already asked you before, and that is, do you consider yourself to be an instrument maker?
An instrument maker? Yeah. Why, of course.
That's what I thought.
I've built these instruments that we fly to very far away places. Now, I don't know what kind of instrument you're thinking of. Do you mean a musical instrument?
Well, yes, because that first time I was in your office and I'm hearing all of these amazing sounds, I thought, you know, that's exactly what Stradivarius was doing 300 years ago or whatever. I mean, you know, people that invent instruments that produce sounds are they allow musicians to be musicians, and so for me it was not a real big stretch to think that this was a very natural association for us. But now that, you know, when I look at all these equations today, after not seeing them for a few months, I think, my God, how do we get into this?
Well, I really didn't think of myself as an instrument maker in the musical sense. But I'll have to say, I did kind of get into this quadraphonic thing. What did you think of that?
Oh, that was fantastic. In fact, I said to Terry, I said, well, you've got 2 days to include that in the piece, too.
Okay.
You laid to rest the question, and you knew in advance that some of us would have the wrong assumption in mind, that there just wasn't any sound in space. But I want to push that a little further. It seems to me that, is that really what you want us to understand? There is sound in space. Or do you want us to understand that there is activity in space that can be at least as well understood as sound as anything else? Because after all, you also put it into graphic and color translation or interpretation or demonstration. And I'm wondering where your bottom line is.
Well, I guess the sounds that we detect in space adds a reality to it that in my mind doesn't sort of exist. I didn't choose to play the crossing of the Jovian bow shock. There's a shock wave out in front of Jupiter, and when Voyager went through it, it actually is, that's my collection, incidentally, that cardboard box there, 40 years, right here. It's in there, but when you go through the bow shock, you hear that, you know, you can't see this shock wave. You can detect it with some other instruments like measuring flow velocities. But when you go through the shock wave, you hear kind of a low rumble, then just a tremendous burst of noise that lasts for about 60 seconds as you go through the shock. And to me, that just added a reality to that thing. You know, you can't see it, but when you hear it, you know it's powerful and it's there. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm kind of rambling just a bit here, trying to answer your question, but
it seems to me, couldn't you equally well give us a visual representation of it?
Oh, yes, of course. We could not hear this and just look at the pictures of
You got
spectrograms.
it right. You are an instrument maker, and what you're doing is finding the instrument that gives us the impulses in space as music.
Yes. I have one other comment, too, I would make to everybody here, that these sounds, and I just played a small fraction of them. There's this plasma medium up there, which is kind of like a gas like in our room, except it's electrically charged. Has all kinds of different types of sounds, different wave modes, we call them. Like here, we're speaking with just a sound wave. It's like a plasma has like 10 different kinds of waves that signals can propagate. And it has this curious property of what I call dispersion, like the Whistler, the high frequencies travel faster than the low frequencies. Can you imagine giving a lecture in a medium like that? What you hear would depend on how far away you are, which is pretty weird. And another point I'll make is that in our atmosphere, if we forget about animate things, like birds, let's just talk about things in nature. There aren't all that many sounds in our atmosphere. We played a little game in my office, remember that?
Yeah,
we said, how many sounds can you think of in nature, not counting animate things? And so, okay, there's waves coming up on a beach. Okay, you can hear sound from that. You can hear wind blowing through trees. But it's extremely rare to hear anything that sounds like music, that has whistling tones and things. And this plasma medium just likes to make that kind of stuff all the time. And almost the entire universe, 99% of the universe is made up of this ionized gas we call plasma. It's once you get above an altitude about 100 miles at the Earth, you get into this medium that's ionized. I'm just rambling on about some of this stuff, but space is really really interesting. Much more interesting, I think, than we ever would have guessed when we launched Engine 3. I mean, Engine 3 was what opened my mind in this respect. In fact, it turned me from an electrical engineer into a physicist, because that's when I decided to go into physics. Yes?
This is a twofold question. First, are these sounds that we're hearing in real time and their original frequency?
Yes, in most cases. The only one that was not, and I forgot to tell you about that, is the one from the Aurora. Actually occurs at a frequency too high to hear, and we've shifted it down so it's in the audio range, but all the other ones were just like you'd hear it. I'm sorry I didn't mention that at the beginning. These are the actual frequencies that exist up there. One other question I might comment on, I use the word sound here to describe these, and you might ask, are these really sound waves? Well, I think if we could make a microphone that would be sensitive enough, we could detect these in space with a microphone. I wouldn't recommend going out there, take your spacesuit helmet off and try to listen to them. That would not be a good idea. But there are sound waves, but they have an electrical character, and it's easier to detect them with an antenna than it is with a microphone.
You touched on the second half of our question, actually. They are sound waves in the sense that, aside from the electrical oscillation, if you could somehow take your helmet off and survive out there, they would move your eardrums and you'd hear something.
Yeah, if you had sensitive enough microphone, you could detect them. The fact is that the gas density in space up there is very low, much lower than here in the ground, so you wouldn't be able to survive. But most of these waves do have a pressure component. In fact, there's one type in the plasma medium we call an ion acoustic wave. It's the same name that we call sound waves. There's an exact plasma analog almost in detail. Yes?
I wonder if you could address a little bit the decision to include choir, like why singers and where the text
Well, that idea actually came from here. The previous director, Wally Chappell, and I had lunch when I first came out to meet with Dr. Gurnett. And he said, gee, there's all these great choirs in the Midwest. Are you going to use the choir? And I'm a singer, too. So I said, oh, there are. So, you know, it looked like a wonderful opportunity to do something that I'm very fond of. I mean, one of the things that we're doing is not trying to mirror science necessarily in this piece, but to work with art, which is artifice, and essentially to, as Willie said, let our imaginations go a little bit wild with just some of the things that are available that we've learned from Dr. Gurnett from the space program. So, you know, sometimes just the name would get me going, like trapped continuum radiation. I mean, what is that? You know, it's trapped, it's continuum, it's radiation, you know, and so sometimes I would try to find a musical model that would express that or something. So, but it wouldn't have anything to do with it. So the choir, again, it's very arbitrary, but since there was a great choir here, and I love to write for voices, that's how it got in the piece.
Notice to my students here that Terry's picking up the terminology of space physics. Any other questions? There may be a class about ready to come in here. I'm not quite sure. Yes?
Sort of a comment. For this event only, you might rename the Kronos Quartet the Dawn Chorus.
The Don Chorus, yeah.
The Dawn Chorus.
Very good. There is something that during the composition of Sun Rings, September 11th, 2001 occurred, and I have found it very important and poignant to kind of know that how the piece took on a different direction at that point. I mentioned that, Terry.
Well, yeah, of course, when this event happened, you know, in all of our lives, I think it changed all of us forever, but what it did for me was I felt like everything I put into the piece then had to have more deeper meaning, or something as deep as I could make it, something that I could feel was, I'd taken it as far as I could, and that it really expressed what was going on in the world today. So a lot of the subsequent writing in this piece actually had a lot to do with what I feel about humanity, my feelings about the kind of peaceful world I'd like to live in, and things like that. So, and actually the chorus parts express this a lot in words. There's two choral pieces, and to some degree they do express ideas of a peaceful world.
Unfortunately, there's a class about to move in here in about 5 minutes. I think we have to terminate it now. I had trouble getting a room, but I want to thank you very much for enriching my life.
Thank you.